Vera has always been an important partner of government, especially its criminal justice agencies. And my experience with Vera, dare I say, actually goes back as far as 1977 when the Institute was still located on Madison Avenue and 37th Street. And my earliest work in the State Corrections Department involved the temporary release program. And Vera was a big partner. And ever since, whenever I have an important programmatic policy question that can be informed by research, the first thing I think about is to reach out to my friends at Vera. The fundamental question, I think, is our national paradigm of how we respond to crime. The question that I've always asked is, what value does parole supervision add? And I think this is a question that Vera and the folks here can be examining. What is the way in which a probation or parole officer affects outcomes? We don't understand well enough the dynamic by which a parole officer influences the outcome, or a probation officer influences the outcome of the defendant that they have under supervision. How do we measure the effectiveness? Is recidivism a sufficient answer? I don't think it is. How many parolees get arrested simply because the police have changed their enforcement practices? And so if that reflects an increase in arrests and it results in an increase in convictions and an increase in short-term jailings, does that mean that parole has failed? On the other hand, are there other ways to measure the effectiveness of parole supervision? Should we be measuring how many parolees are employed? Should we be measuring how many parolees are drug-free at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? We don't have good performance measures for our community supervision programs, and I think that's an area where Vera has tremendous capacity. Another question that has bugged me, I guess, that I'd love to know the answer to, is in somewhat the same vein. Drug courts. We all like the notion of treatment courts. We think that they are successful. We think there is some evidence of their success, yet I am not hopeful that the drug court movement will be able to move to scale. And I think part of the reason is that we don't have enough evidence to show that they can be effective when they take all comers. And also we don't, as with probation and parole, we don't have a good enough understanding, we don't have a theoretical construct that explains to us if they work, why do they work, so what is the essential element of drug courts that we would need to replicate? The cost of processing every criminal defendant with a drug problem in New York through drug courts is I think, insurmountable. And of course, with revisions to the Rockefeller drug laws, it begs the question of whether you even need it or whether, everybody's going to get diverted in courts irrespective of whether they're drug courts, which actually appears to be what's happening. And so we really need to understand what that means in terms of outcomes. We need to follow the individuals whose cases are being diverted without any enrollment in intensive drug treatment, without any follow-up, without any further court supervision as a result of the Rockefeller drug laws, and ask the question, do they do better, do they do worse, and understand why. We hear so much about best practices and evidence-based practice, and I guess in my lame attempt at humor, I would say, what is the evidence that evidence-based practice works? I haven't seen evidence in layman's terms. I don't understand this concept of meta-analysis, and perhaps somebody here could explain it to me in layman's terms. And I just haven't seen enough evidence that engaging in evidence-based practice yields treatment results that can be worthwhile for the cost that it takes. They talk about needing to address 6 or 7 of the identified treatment needs after you've gone through this extensive risk needs assessment. And then they say that where evidence-based practice is employed and and where the program has integrity and where the risk principle is followed and the need principle is followed and all the various principles of effective interventions, that they obtain a 10 to 20% reduction in recidivism. I want to know, how does that compare with helping a person find a job? Because I don't think evidence-based practice finds a person a job. And I'd like to know more about the relationship between employment and housing and sobriety. And is it more important to focus on changing the offender's antisocial attitudes than it is to help them find a place to live? Another question that has bedeviled me is, as we think about reentry, certainly we have to begin today, if we haven't already, to develop the empirical evidence of its efficacy. I was very disturbed just in the last week or two. The Urban Institute issued its final report on its evaluation of the Savory Project, Serious Violent Offender Reentry Initiative. And the findings from that report were, quite frankly, disheartening. It found that the differences between the Savory participants and the non-Savory participants after 2 years out were no different. And it found, what it said was two things. One, we spent a lot more money on the people who were receiving the services under Serious Violent Offender Reentry Initiative grants. Two, that the level of services that were delivered did not ultimately meet expectations. And three, that the outcomes really were not appreciably different. Now, and that's probably one of the most exhaustive studies of a reentry initiative that's been done so far by really reputable researchers. And as a person who believes very deeply in the importance of reentry work, I think that researchers like the folks at Vera have to be delving into that. I think, too, that one of the questions that doesn't get asked when we talk about reentry is talked about these days as if it exists separate and apart from the existence of a prison. But the fact is that everybody who is reentering has had an experience, and does the experience that they had in prison influence the outcome? We've not established any relationship between whether or not a person who had a demeaning, brutalizing experience of imprisonment is going to do better or worse than a person who didn't. I think that there is a human rights element to our imprisonment work in the United States that has to be explored. We haven't examined the relationship between drug use in prison and drug use after prison, and how eradicating drug use and eliminating drug use and creating drug-free environments inside prisons and jails promotes reentry success. We don't know what are the elements, really. We haven't been able to correlate individuals who receive evidence-based interventions versus individuals who receive substantial help with finding jobs and stabilizing their family in terms of their reentry outcomes. Another issue, and this is one that Vera has been very deeply immersed in, and an area in which I think that they've had an impact. The Governor's Task Force on Juvenile Justice was really a very powerful and important document. And one of the unanswered questions that continues to hang out there is this issue of what do we do with the 16 to 18-year-olds in New York State. And this is a very New York State-specific question, right? New York is now one of only 2 states that has laws on the books that treat 16-year-olds as adults for purposes of criminal adjudication. There's a large number of advocates who say that 16 to 18-year-olds should not be in the adult criminal justice system. And I will testify to the fact from personal experience that 16 to 18-year-olds really are a very problematic group of individuals to have in custody in a jail system. They gave me more headaches than all of the adults ever did. Yet and still, I am concerned, and I don't think we know enough about what the effect would be if 16, 17, and 18-year-olds in New York were integrated back into the juvenile justice system. We know, for example, that some of the protections that they receive in the adult system don't exist. It was only as a result of the work that we did at Probation and with Vera to create the risk assessment instrument that we now have some sort of a logical, rational, consistent, thoughtful decision-making guideline for making detention decisions in New York. The whole idea of who gets detained in the juvenile system is far less well developed than it is in the adult system, where you have the criminal justice agency and you have a presumption of release. The notion of preventive detention still applies in our juvenile justice system. So I'm not sure that you would want to take 16 and 17-year-olds out of the adult system and put them back and expose them to that. We also know that it takes forever to complete a case, that a lot of the speedy trial rules that apply and that help to the extent that the system operates at all, and that's a whole other story, the system really doesn't operate real efficiently in terms of disposing of cases on the adult side. But on the juvenile side, it's even worse. The juvenile cases can drag on forever. And we know that judges make decisions about incarceration in the juvenile system for reasons having nothing to do with the respondent's criminality or the crime they've committed or their dangerousness, but rather with their perception of the adequacy of the home or their truancy. So I fear that moving 16 and 17-year-olds out of the adult system and into the juvenile system may in fact diminish their rights. Here's where action research and the kind of thinking that Vera brings to bear on projects could be helpful in helping the city to think this through.